It was a dry summer dawn in June 1958 when the scent of honeysuckle first drifted through our little wooden window, and that very smell has never quite left me. I'm Eleanor May Johnston, though most folks around the commune simply called me Ellie back then. I remember the sky still dark, a ribbon of pale gold on the horizon, and how the air felt thick with promise, even if I didn't fully understand what kind of promise it was. That old wooden floor creaked under my bare feet as I tiptoed into the parlor, where Mother was already kneeling on the rug, whispering her morning prayers before the day's sermon. Her voice trembled with a mixture of devotion and something I couldn't name, but it tugged at my heart the way a mother's lullaby might. And in that moment, I felt the first stirring of a memory that, to this day, keeps my heart restless. At this point, if you've ever felt that mix of hope and unease when you smell something you haven't smelled in years, give this little story a like or leave me a comment, just so I know you're right here with me. I know, dear viewer, that might sound a touch forward for someone my age, but this tale belongs as much to you as it does to me. See, I've carried this memory in my heart for 60 years, tucked away behind other days filled with chores and lessons and lullabies. Yet every now and then, often when the cicadas hum in the Texas heat, I find myself back on that creaky floor, listening to Mother's soft, God's plan incantations. It's that very phrase, whispered almost too sweetly, that sets my mind racing each time. I want to take you back to those days in our little religious commune out in West Texas, where the land stretches flat and golden for miles. It was the mid-50s, and life moved at the pace of prayer and hard work. We rose with the sun to tend the communal garden, and by noon, dust swirled around our ankles as we knelt to give thanks for every tomato and every stalk of wheat. Mother would smile at me then, her eyes glinting with pride. "You're my blessing, Ellie," she'd say, tracing a finger along my cheek. And I believed her with all my heart. But even in that gentle warmth, there were cracks forming in the foundation of my world. Sometimes I'd peek through the lace curtains and watch the other children laughing by the well, their voices echoing across the dry earth, and I'd wonder whether the life we led, so sheltered, so steeped in ritual, was the only one possible. Yet whenever that curiosity stirred too deep, Mother would place her hand on my shoulder and remind me that everything we endured, every sacrifice we made, was part of God's plan. And just like that, my questions would settle like dust in the still air. That sense of sheltered safety was comforting, yes, but it was also the same safety that kept me from seeing the shadows gathering in our midst. I wouldn't learn the full weight of those shadows until years later, when the congregation's whispers turned darker and the sermons grew harsher. But for now, in this very first glimpse of memory, I only felt the sweet ache of nostalgia, like the taste of old apricot jam on a summer morning. It's a warmth I cling to, even though beneath it lay the seeds of something far more troubling. So here we begin, on that honeysuckle-tinged dawn in June, a young girl named Ellie, kneeling beside her mother, convinced that every breath, every sunrise, was proof of a loving Creator's grand design. I still feel the ache of that belief in my bones, even as I prepare to share what came next, how faith wove itself into something darker, and how I came to see the thin line between devotion and control. But let's linger a moment longer in the golden haze of that summer dawn, because it's where my story truly starts, and where perhaps your own questions first find their whisper. It was July of 1962, and the West Texas sun had already begun to bake the dusty road outside our little commune by mid-morning. I was only 8 years old then, just a freckle-faced child with tangled brown hair and big, curious eyes that never seemed to stop wondering. Our home was a low, weathered clapboard house painted pale blue, surrounded by a ramshackle white picket fence that Mother swore kept the bad spirits out. Beyond the fence, sagebrush and mesquite trees stretched as far as the eye could see, their shadows flickering on the dry earth. In those days, The scent of dust and creosote hung in the air alongside the faint perfume of desert wildflowers, and every morning the rooster's crow echoed through our narrow lanes like a brass trumpet calling us to prayer. I used to wake before dawn, slipping on my worn leather sandals and tiptoeing past Papa's workshop, where relics of old church pews and hymn book scraps lay in neat piles, toward the communal well. The other children and I would laugh softly as we filled our tin cups with cool water, our breath turning to mist in the chill morning air. Sigh. We'd carry our jugs back to the porch, balancing them carefully on our hips, and Mother would be there waiting in her simple calico dress, her hair pinned up in a neat bun. "Good morning, my little dove," she'd say, brushing a finger across my forehead, leaving a smudge of chalk-white dust on my skin. "Today we give thanks for another day in His grace." I believed her then, believed that our tiny world, full of wooden benches and hymn singing, was the center of everything good. Sunday mornings were the brightest. The whole commune would gather in our chapel, a bare-bones building with rough-hewn beams and whitewashed walls. Sunlight filtered in through narrow slats, painting golden stripes across the floor. We'd stand shoulder to shoulder, voices rising in unison for hours as we sang psalms of praise, our hearts and knees bowed in worship. I was a quiet child, eyes downcast but heart soaring, dreaming of all the wonderful things God had in store for me, perhaps a day when I'd teach Sunday school, or travel to far-off places carrying His light. But life here was not without its routines and traditions, simple and sweet though they seemed. We gathered every evening around a long oak table, bowls of hearty stew, freshly baked cornbread, and glasses of iced herbal tea made from sage and mint that Papa grew in his little garden. I'd sit between my brother Samuel and my sister Ruth, my elbows propped on the table as I told tales of the birds I'd seen at dawn or the shapes the clouds made in the sky. After supper, the adults would share verses from the good book, sometimes reading passages I didn't fully understand, but whose words felt like gentle lanterns illuminating hidden corners of my mind. In those moments, I was content, believing that kindness was the greatest virtue of all. I thought people always returned kindness tenfold, a loaf of bread for a smile, a warm blanket for a prayer. I dreamed of being helpful, of being someone who put others first, just like Mother. Often, I'd wander through the fields at dusk, gathering wild chamomile blossoms to dry by the hearth, humming hymns under my breath. Long pause. I remember thinking then that nothing could ever shake the peace I felt, no storm, no sickness, no sorrow. The world beyond our fence was a distant rumor, and I had no reason to doubt that life would only grow broader and kinder as I grew older. Yet, even in those sweet childhood days, I caught glimpses of something stirring beneath the surface. Whispers passing behind cupped hands, glances exchanged in the shadows of the chapel's rafters. Sometimes, late at night, I'd tiptoe down the hallway and notice the other women in hushed conversation, their voices low and urgent. I didn't understand their words, but I felt the tension in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Still, I carried on in my innocent belief that the world was a kindly place and that every soul who walked its dusty roads did so under the gentle guidance of a loving Creator. So that was my world at 8 years old, simple, sun-drenched, and built on faith. I was a child of the commune, a daughter of prayer and morning dew, certain that every dawn held a promise of goodness. Little did I know how those early roots of faith would grow tangled with darker branches as I edged toward adolescence. But for now, on that summer morning in July 1962, all I knew was the warmth of the sun, the hush of our prayers, and the sweet comfort of believing that kindness would always find its way home. It was late afternoon in September of 1965, and the sun slanted low over the dusty courtyard when I first noticed the way Father looked at me. I had gone out to the old barn, just beyond the garden fence, to fetch a bundle of kindling for Mother's evening fire. The barn door was half open, and inside, The air was cool and smelled of hay and cedar. I paused in the threshold, blinking against the shafts of light that danced across the loose straw on the floor. There he was, my father, Jonathan, his broad shoulders bent as he stacked split logs against the far wall. He wore that faded denim shirt of his, the one with the frayed cuffs, and his dark hair, usually so rumpled by Don's chores, was slicked back neatly as if he'd spent the afternoon straightening it for some special reason. I cleared my throat softly so I wouldn't startle him. "Father," I called, voice catching in my throat. He straightened and turned, and for a moment all I saw was the hard, kind face I knew from backyard lessons in scripture. But then his eyes, I can still feel them, lingered on me in a way that made my chest tighten. My breath came quick, and I pressed a hand to my heart, amazed at how loudly it beat. "I need some wood for Mother's fire," I managed to say, though my voice trembled like the last leaf on a branch. He nodded slowly, but didn't hand me the kindling right away. Instead, he stepped closer, brushing a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. His hand was warm, and in that unexpected touch I felt a flutter of something both thrilling and unsettling. "You're growing into such a fine young woman, Ellie," he said, voice soft, almost reverent. I remember thinking, I didn't understand why those words made me feel both proud and afraid all at once. Behind me, the late-day cicadas droned, and somewhere Mother's hymn from the chapel drifted on the breeze. But in that barn, time seemed to hush around us. I swallowed, trying to find my footing, and reached for the bundle of kindling he still held out to me. My fingers brushed his, and the heat of his hand sent a shiver through my arm. "Thank you, Father," I whispered, but my gaze dropped to the rough wood in my lap, guilt and wonder rising together like storm clouds. That moment, so quiet, so heavy, changed everything without a word more. I felt as though a door had swung open in my heart, revealing a hallway I had never known existed. Later, when I told Mother I had helped Father in the barn, she gave me a tender smile and murmured, "Everything happens according to God's plan." "God's plan," I repeated, tasting the words on my tongue as if they might steady my racing thoughts. But they didn't. Instead, they echoed hollowly, reminding me that not all plans are as gentle as they sound. Over the next few days, I found myself watching Father from the edge of the garden, tracing the shape of his silhouette against the setting sun. I noticed the curve of his neck, the way his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, the faint scar near his wrist where he'd once cut himself on a splinter. Every time our eyes met, I felt a rush, a flutter deep inside that I couldn't explain. I busied myself with chores, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, but my hands trembled, and my mind spun with questions I dared not speak. Then there was Aunt Clara, our kindly neighbor who sometimes came by to sew quilts with Mother. She glanced at me one afternoon, the needle paused over a patch of fabric, and said with a knowing look, "You're in that sweet, tender age, dear. The world is full of new feelings, and sometimes we don't know what to do with them." I smiled politely, but her words only added to the whirlpool inside me. New feelings indeed, feelings I was both drawn to and terrified of. It was in those quiet hours that I realized my simple childhood had fractured in a single afternoon. The farm's rhythms continued, the morning prayers, the midday meals, the evening gatherings, but a secret current had begun to flow beneath the surface of my days. I could not unfeel the way my heart pounded at Father's glance, nor could I forget the soft tremor in his voice when he called me my fine young woman. And so, as September slipped into October, I carried that moment like a hidden ember in my chest, wondering what it might ignite, and dreading the heat it promised. It was the early winter of 1966 when our little world began to crack. I remember the frost on the window panes one cold January morning, the way the pale light of dawn struggled through the thin curtains, and how I felt a strange twisting in my chest as I heard Mother's voice sharp with worry instead of her usual gentle hymn. Papa had fallen ill, some fever that wouldn't break, and in our commune, illness was a test of faith more than a call for doctors. I watched from the hallway as the other women surrounded his bed, praying over him in hushed tones, their eyes shining with fear and fierce hope. I wanted to run to his side, to hold his hand and tell him everything would be all right, but Mother placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Not now, darling," she said, her voice trembling. "This is between him and the Lord." I nodded, though anger flared inside me that people I loved were suffering while we did nothing but chant and wait. That same week, the elders delivered word that our small schoolhouse would be closing, that they'd sell the land and move us further west, deeper into the scrubland, where fleshly temptations were said to be less likely to find our children. The news spread through the commune like wildfire. Some families packed their meager belongings at once. Others wept in the chapel, clutching hymnals as if they would guide them through the unknown. I felt torn exactly the way I felt when I first noticed Father's glance in the barn, pulled between the comfort of the only home I'd ever known and a roiling fear of what lay beyond. I spent that afternoon in the granary, tracing circles in the dust with my fingertips, trying to study the pounding in my ribcage. I was 8 once, free and trusting. Now I was 12, caught between childhood illusions and a world that seemed to be shifting under my feet. As January turned to February, Papa's fever broke, but something in him had changed. His once booming laughs at evening meals were replaced by long silences and distant stares. He no longer tended the garden with the same easy patience, and Mother's own prayers took on an edge of desperation I had never heard before. One evening, after I'd filled our cups at the well, I asked if I could fetch him a glass of water. Mother shook her head, lips pressed tight. "He must face this trial alone," she whispered. I felt a flash of resentment at the sickness, at the elders, at the faith that wouldn't let me help the man who'd always held me up when I was hurting. But I said nothing, only carried the water inside and laid it on the bedside table, hoping he'd see it and understand my love. Then came the prohibition that felt like a lash across my heart. The elders decided that, until we settled in our new location, the girls of a certain age were no longer to attend the Sunday market in town. They claimed it was to protect our virtue, to guard our hearts against worldly corruption. I remember standing at the fence line that first Sunday, watching the older girls, my friends, mount their horses and ride away with baskets of quilts to trade for flour and sugar. I begged Mother to let me go. I argued that I could be useful, that I wasn't a child anymore. She only shook her head, tears in her eyes. "The Lord will provide," she said, and turned away. In those weeks, I felt a turmoil I could not name, a storm of sadness, anger, and shame that whirled in my gut. I skipped stones on the dried-up creek bed, wishing I could skip ahead to a time when things made sense again. I cried myself to sleep some nights, imagining Father's withered frame in his bed, imagining the other girls in town, soaring free while I was trapped behind fences of piety. Yet even in that haze of confusion, I sought anyone to lean on. Aunt Clara came by one afternoon, bearing a small tin of sugar cookies. She found me in the sewing room, head bent over a half-stitched quilt, and sat beside me without a word. For a moment, we shared the silence. Then she whispered, "It's not your fault, dear heart. You're doing your best." And in her presence, I felt a flicker of comfort, as though I might one day find my way out of this maze of rules and sorrow. But the questions had taken root. Was faith meant to cage us or to set us free? Could kindness and, yes, love survive within walls built so high? And most of all, I wondered whether the God I'd worshipped since childhood cared more for our obedience than for our hearts. These were the first real shadows of my life, and as I lay in bed each night with the wind rattling the shutters, I prayed not only for Papa's health, but for the courage to face what was coming next. I remember the moment as if the whole world held its breath. August of 1968, a blistering midday sun pressing down on the dusty courtyard, when I finally heard the truth in Father's own voice. I'd slipped away from the chores to fetch water, as I often did when the air felt too thick with unspoken things, and there he was in the shade of the granary, his face drawn and hard, Mother at his side with eyes rimmed in red. I froze at the well, the wooden bucket slipping from my fingers, splashing shallow ripples across the sunlit stones. Time itself seemed to stop, every bird's trill suspended, every tumbleweed halted mid-roll as I watched them turn toward me. "Ellie," Mother called, her voice brittle as dry twigs. And in that single syllable, I felt my heart crack open. I walked to them slowly, my feet heavy in the dust, each step echoing in my ears. Father's eyes met mine, and I saw in them not the warmth I once knew, but something colder, something I had never imagined could live in his gaze. "You must understand," he said, voice low and steady, "this is all part of God's plan." The words landed like stones in my chest. God's plan. The same phrase that had comforted me all these years now felt like a whip across my faith. I tried to speak, to ask how a plan that blessed our harvests and healed our wounds could also lead to this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I saw the flicker of fear in Mother's eyes, the tremble of her hand as she reached for mine. She took my hand and squeezed it, and I realized in that instant that her love had become a chain, as binding and unbreakable as the oaths we took in the chapel. My breath caught in my throat, and a hot sting of tears blurred my vision. I thought you loved me," I whispered, the shock of betrayal making my voice crack. Father's face softened for only a moment, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of nausea through me. "Of course I love you," he insisted, stepping closer so that the heat of his body brushed against mine. "But love takes many forms in the eyes of the Lord." My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, burying my face in my hands. The dust rose around me like the ghosts of every innocent prayer I'd ever whispered. That was the moment I lost everything I thought I knew. I lost my trust in the world I'd built, my faith in the rituals and the hymns. I lost the sweet comfort of Mother's embrace and the strength I'd once drawn from Father's guiding hand. I felt small and powerless, an 8-year-old child suddenly told she was something other than innocent, something the world would never forgive. The shame washed over me in hot, searing waves, and I wanted to vanish into the dry earth beneath my feet. As I knelt there, the granary's rafters groaned in the heat, and somewhere beyond the fence the wind stirred the dry grass like anxious hands. I clenched my fists in the dusty soil, rage and grief battling inside me. How could the God I worshipped, the God who taught us to love and protect the least among us, sanction something so twisted? God's plan. I echoed into the stillness, each word laced with bitter disbelief. The silence that followed felt like the final tolling of a bell, an unholy knell for the innocence I'd buried that day. When I finally rose, my legs shaky but my resolve strangely steady, I knew life would never be the same. I brushed the dust from my dress and looked up at them both, at the faces that had once defined home. "I won't be a part of this," I said, voice trembling yet fierce. "Not anymore." And with one last look at the place I'd always called safe, I turned away, carrying with me the weight of what I'd discovered and the heavy knowledge that the greatest betrayal can come from the ones we love most. After that day in August of 1968, I retreated into a hush so deep it felt like I'd stepped into another world, a world without sound, without laughter, without the gentle hum of cicadas at dusk. For weeks, I wandered the dusty paths of our little commune as if sleepwalking, my footsteps echoing on the cracked earth, my heart beating behind a pane of glass. I barely spoke, and when I did, my voice was flat and distant, like a song humming on a broken record. The chores went on around me, feeding the chickens, tending the withered garden, stacking firewood for another cold dawn, but I moved through each task in slow motion, as though weighed down by a blanket of grief and disbelief. I remember one afternoon, I was mending Papa's old work shirt by the window, the afternoon sun slanting in through the lace curtains, and I realized I hadn't eaten more than a few spoonfuls of porridge in days. My hands shook with hunger, but I couldn't bring myself to lift the spoon. I was so empty inside that even food felt like a betrayal of the emptiness, as though each bite would remind me of what I'd lost, the faith I once carried like a lantern, the trust one once held as a shield, the innocence I once wore like a favorite dress. I set the bowl down and let the needle slip from my grasp, watching it roll across the wooden floor until it vanished beneath the hearth. Night times were the hardest. I'd lie awake in the darkness, the thin blanket tangled around my legs, and stare at the pale beam of moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the door. I'd reach out, half expecting to find Father's strong hand or Mother's gentle clasp, only to grasp at empty air. In those silent hours, I questioned everything I'd ever been taught. Was faith meant to comfort us or to bind us in silence? Was kindness a gift or a trap? I felt the world shift beneath me, entire beliefs crumbling like the brittle mortar of our chapel walls. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the hollow thump of my heart, and wondered if I would ever hear music in my bones again. Some days, I found myself sitting by the fence, watching the horizon glow with restless heat as the sun sank low, and I wept not with loud sobs, but with gentle tears that stole down my cheeks like dewdrops slipping from a petal. I cried for the child I'd been, for the warm comfort of Mother's lullabies, for the simple joy of believing in a plan that I now understood had none for me. I cried for the woman I'd become, a woman forced to carry secrets darker than any night, secrets that no one in our commune could ever know. And in that weeping, I felt a strange kinship with the land itself, parched and silent, cracked and waiting for rain. Yet, even in that vast emptiness, a small seed of something else took root. I began to rise before dawn again, not out of habit, but out of need to feel the cool morning air on my face, to watch the sky shift from ink black to pale blue, to remind myself that day followed night, no matter how dark the night. I picked wild chamomile blossoms once more, letting their gentle scent fill my nostrils, and folded them between pages of an old hymnal. Though I no longer read the words inside, I kept the book close to my heart as a talisman against despair. It was in those quiet moments, as I watched the first birds return to the scrubland, that I realized something precious had survived. A flicker of hope, faint but stubborn. I wouldn't let that hope be snuffed out by betrayal or fear. I began to speak softly to myself, murmuring promises of resilience. I will find my way, I'd say, until the words felt less like echoes and more like firm ground under my feet. My faith, once a rigid fortress, had splintered, but in its place I found a gentler faith in myself, a faith that whispered I could heal, I could learn, I could choose my own path. And so I lived in that space between what had been and what could be, still tethered to memories of the past, yet reaching toward a future I would define on my own terms. The silence remained, but it was no longer a prison, it was a canvas, waiting for the colors of my reclaimed life. That winter of silence was my crucible, and though it left me changed, it also taught me that even in the deepest cold, the human heart can learn to bloom again. It was a late spring morning in May of 1969 when I felt the first tremor of hope stir in my chest, like the soft rustle of new leaves after a long, cold winter. I'd been trudging through the same dusty routines, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, stringing up the laundry, each task as hollow as the one before. My heart still ached from the wounds of the past, and my prayers were more whispers to the wind than conversations with God. But that day, as I rounded the corner of the barnyard with a bucket of eggs in hand, I saw young Ruth N., the little preacher's daughter from the next homestead over, struggling to coax her frightened calf into the milking stall. The poor thing was skittish, kicking up dust and lowing softly in distress, and Ruth N. stood there in her bonnet and overalls, tears running down her face in her earnest effort to calm it. Without thinking, I set my bucket down and approached her, my old bones creaking as I knelt beside the trembling calf. "Now, dear heart," I whispered, because that's what we women of our generation said. "Just take a breath and speak kindly." I placed a gentle hand on its flank and murmured a few soft words, the way I used to sing lullabies to my own children when they were babes. The calf's ears perked and its eyes softened as it nuzzled my palm, and Ruth Ann's face brightened with relief. "Thank you, Grandma Ellie," she said, using that affectionate nickname Mother had once given me so long ago. And in that single, unexpected thank you, a warmth bloomed inside me, a quiet recognition that I still had something to give. From that moment on, I found myself looking for small ways to be of help. I began teaching Ruth Ann to read from my old, worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, sitting on the back porch with chipped teacups of mint tea between us. I showed her how to patch a frayed quilt square, and how to tend a wounded bird with soft cloth and whispered prayers. Each time I saw her shy smile, I felt my own spirit lift, as though I were watching tiny seeds of purpose take root in both our hearts. It wasn't grand or glorious work, just the kind of everyday kindness a grandmother might offer, but it felt like the first gentle pulse of life returning to my lens. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the fields in golden light, I decided to start a little lending library under the old pecan tree by the chapel. I gathered a handful of battered books, hymnals, poetry volumes, and even a tattered romance novel Mother frowned upon, and arranged them on a rough wooden shelf I'd fashioned from spare planks. I nailed up a hand-painted sign, "Ellie's Little Lending Tree. Take a book, leave a blessing." I could scarcely believe the thrill that danced through me as I hammered in the last nail. That evening, I found a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets in place of my battered poetry book, and a folded note inside read, "Thank you for sharing. Aunt Ellie, your kindness warms us all." It felt as though someone had placed a lantern in the darkest hollow of my soul. I began to carry my small acts of service like cherished treasures, and each one reminded me that my life still held meaning beyond the shadow of past betrayals. My faith, once rigid and brittle, softened into something more resilient, a faith I could shape with my own two hands, a faith rooted in kindness, in teaching, in sharing the simple gifts I'd learned over my 60-odd years. It was a humble second chance, but to me, it was everything. And though I still paused at dawn, listening to cicadas in the heat, I now listened for the quiet calls of those around me, the soft cry of a calf, the hesitant laugh of a child, the rustle of pages turning in borrowed books. In those sounds, I found a new rhythm to my days and a gentle hope that, by the grace of God and a grandmother's small mercies, my life could bloom once more. There came a morning in late summer of 1969 when I stood at the edge of our little lending tree, watching sunlight dance through the pecan leaves, and I felt something shift deep within me. I had carried the weight of my past for so long, the secrets I thought would bury me alive, the shame I believed would define me forever. But in that moment, as I watched a young mother cradle her newborn beneath my sign, I realized that forgiveness isn't a luxury reserved for saints, it is a lifeline for the wounded. I reached into my shawl pocket and drew out the small leather-bound journal I had kept hidden all these years, the one filled with trembling entries of fear, guilt, and sorrow. My fingers trembled as I opened it to the first page, where I had written of that June dawn in 1958, believing every sunrise was proof of a loving plan. I traced the ink with a fingertip, feeling the ridges of each word, and for the first time I saw those words not as chains, but as stepping stones. With a steady breath, I closed the journal and tucked it under my arm. I knew what I had to do. I walked to the far corner of the yard where the old stone fireplace stood, once used for communal meals, now cold and unused, and set the journal upon the ledge. I hesitated only a moment before striking a match and flicking it to the paper. The edges curled, blackening as pages caught flame and curled into ash. I watched the fire consume every word I had written in desperation, every tear I had poured onto those pages, and felt a fierce, cleansing flame kindle inside my heart. As the last ember died, I whispered, I choose to live on. With no claims, no regrets, just on. I carried the ashes to the dried-up creek bed beyond our fence and scattered them to the wind, watching them drift like tiny motes of freedom across the parched earth. In that simple act, I laid down the burden I had carried for 10 long years. The sun beat warm on my shoulders, the cicadas called in the heat, and I felt, for the first time since I was a child, that I owned my own breath. The past had shaped me, its pain, its betrayals, its silent prayers, but it would not shackle my future. I raised my face to the sky, eyes closed against the brightness, and breathed in the scent of wild chamomile and dry grass, feeling acceptance settle deep into my bones. When I returned to the Lending Tree, Ruth Ann ran to me, her face alight with a new poem she'd just learned. I laughed, a real, unburdened laugh, and promised to write it down in a fresh notebook I'd brought for her. That fresh notebook, blank and waiting, became a symbol of my own life unwritten. I would fill my pages with acts of kindness, with lessons passed on, with laughter and tears borne openly. I would teach others that love is strength, not silence, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand tall despite it. I sold my share of the commune's land that autumn and moved into a small cottage on the edge of town, where neighbors waved as they passed and offered homemade pies. I planted a rose bush by the front door, knowing roses bloom even after the harshest frost. Each petal reminded me that beauty can follow pain, that joy can grow from sorrow. And every morning, I rise with the sun, not out of duty, but out of wonder, thankful that my story did not end in that granary or those hushed prayers. I will always carry the memory of those years with me, the honeysuckle dawns, the creaky floors, the tremor of forbidden touches, but they are no longer the script that dictates my days. I hold my head high, my heart open, and my hands ready to give and receive grace. Because at last I have understood, the past is a chapter, not the whole book. And I chose to live on, with no claims, no regrets, just on. Looking back now, I see that my life was a tapestry woven with threads of both pain and perseverance, and the truth I carry with me isn't wrapped up in tidy morals, but in hard-earned wisdom. In my childhood, I believed that obedience and faith would shield me from harm, that kindness meant never asking questions, and that God's plan was a gentle map guiding my every step. Yet when that map led me into shadows I never imagined, I learned that faith without questions can harden into chains, and kindness without boundaries can morph into silence. Today, I no longer wait for permission to live, nor do I measure my worth by the approval of others. Instead, I have discovered that the most profound freedom comes when we honor our own voice, when we dare to say, "This is not right for me," and choose a different path even when our hands tremble and our hearts ache. I understand now that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the quiet resolve to carry on despite it. When I shared my small acts of service under the Lending Tree, it wasn't because I sought praise, but because giving, even in the smallest measure, rekindles hope in both the giver and the receiver. I learned that healing often arrives in whispers, a child's shy smile, a neighbor's grateful nod, the soft turning of borrowed pages beneath a pecan canopy. These moments reminded me that our scars need not define us, they can become windows through which light enters. If there's one thing I wish for you, dear listener, it's this. Don't wait for the world to hand you permission to step into your own story. Perhaps it's time to lay down the burdens that aren't yours, to carry old regrets, others' expectations, the echo of a sermon that told you to stay silent. Maybe it's time to step beyond the fences built by fear and speak your truth, tender though it may be. Because life doesn't wait for the perfect moment or the final answer, It unfolds in the messy fragile now, and every breath is an opportunity to rewrite our next chapter. I won't pretend mine was an extraordinary journey. Many face hardships more grievous than mine, and I stand on the shoulders of those whose suffering remains unspoken. But I do know this: every woman, every man, every soul touched by hurt can choose kindness for themselves, can plant seeds of resilience in their own backyard. Whether through a simple act, a letter sent, a hand extended, a song shared, or through a grand leap into the unknown, we hold the power to shape our lives with intention and grace. So listen closely to your own heart's quiet murmurings. When it whispers that you deserve better, believe it. When it urges you to speak, let your voice rise. When it invites you to forgive, know that forgiving is not forgetting. It's releasing the hold the past has on your spirit. And when it beckons you toward a humble act of kindness, follow with an open palm and an honest smile. I carry my scars like the rings of an old oak, proof that life's storms passed through and that I stood my ground. And if my story can offer one gift, let it be this: that you too can stand in your truth, free from chains of silence, and bloom in the light of your own choosing. Perhaps, dear friend, it's time for you to stop waiting and begin living the life you were always meant to lead. And here we are, dear friend, at the edge of my tale, yet standing right beside today's sunrise. I've shared with you the honeysuckle dawns of my childhood, the shadows that crept through our chapel, and the fierce flame that finally set my spirit free. But this story is not tethered only to the past. It lives in the gentle breeze that rustles the pecan leaves, in the soft murmur of library pages turning under a summer sky, and in the quiet moments when I pause and ask myself, what does love truly mean? I look at my hands, wrinkled now, with veins like winding paths, and remember the first time I felt my heart tremble under Father's gaze, and how I chose to step away from that dark silence into a life I could call my own. I think of the lending tree I planted, where neighbors still leave books, and of the rose bush by my front door, its blossoms bolder each year. Every petal reminds me that love can return, if only we give it water and light, and that sometimes the sweetest blooms follow the harshest winters. So I turn to you, watching through your screen with all the warmth in my heart. Do you believe that true love should come back? Does it deserve a second chance to find you where you are now? Or do we let it wander off, trusting that if it's meant to be, it will circle back on its own? I don't have a final answer, only the quiet hope that perhaps, like the birds returning to the scrubland each spring, love can return too, wiser and more tender. And on some evenings, when the sky glows soft and pink and the cicadas hum their lullaby, I still catch myself wondering about him, the young man who once saved me from my own sorrow, whose gentle hand showed me that love could be a beacon rather than a chain. Sometimes I think he still remembers, and I find myself smiling at the thought, letting the memory settle around me like a shawl of comfort. So I leave you with this gentle invitation: carry your own memories close, but don't let them weigh you down. Open your heart to new chapters, new chances, new blossoms waiting to unfurl. And when you find yourself at the crossroads of past and present, ask yourself what true love means in your own story, and whether you have the courage to let it return, or to send it on its way, trusting that life's sweetest gifts often come full circle. Thank you for listening, dear friend. May your days be filled with kindness, your spirit with courage, and your heart with the enduring wonder of love's endless possibilities.